Hello and welcome to another episode of Scream Theory. So in this video, I want to show some strategies that might make it easier to learn how to do both fry screaming and false chord screaming simultaneously. Some people refer to this as hybrid screams, but I try to refrain from using any terminology that might just cause more confusion in metal vocals, so I just have always called it doing fry screaming and false chord screaming simultaneously. It's a little bit more wordy, but I think it helps being more descriptive in what we're saying to eliminate confusion. So not only is this the most complex distorted vocal technique, this is the most complex form of human phonation there is. For most people, this is really going to take years to become proficient at doing, because optimally, we want to be able to do both techniques at a high level of skill individually. We have a limited amount of attention, and when learning any complex motor task, beginners will devote most of their attention to the most simple elements of that task. But over time, as we get better at doing that task and those simple elements become more automatic, that frees up our attention to focus on the finer details. With screaming, this might be focusing more on how we're pronouncing our words, how we're managing our airflow, and how we're changing the shape of our mouth, our throat, our tongue, and our lips to slightly alter the tones that we're producing with each technique. So optimally, we want to be pretty much automatic with doing both techniques individually, but at the very minimum, be really good at doing one technique and just be pretty decent at doing the other technique. We just want that overflow of attention that we can now devote to focusing on doing both techniques at the same time. So let's say we can do both techniques individually. Well, what comes next? Well, I would say learn to switch between using both techniques on the fly. A really common trend in metal vocals is people using high-pitched fry screams and low-pitched false chord screams. Now, not every vocalist does this, but for whatever reason, a lot of vocalists do scream in this way, and I think one of the best examples of this was Trevor of the Black Dahlia Murder. He would switch between using his really screechy high-pitched fry screams and his really belchy-sounding low-pitched false chord screams.
Father, I know that you've witnessed the darkness in me, spun in the shadows of the old yellow tree. I'm gonna stand a bright reflection of our inhumanity, the words exaggeration of the lost and darkest of dreams.
So to give you some practice material, I've included a list of bands with vocalists in the description that quite often switch between high-pitched fry screams and low-pitched false chord screams. And then there's another list of bands with vocalists that also do use both techniques simultaneously. And the reason why I'm suggesting this is because if we get really good at doing a low-pitched false chord scream and then instantly switching into a high-pitched fry scream, well, over time, as we get better at that, we can then try to bridge the gap in our mid-range. And we might not do this purposefully at first. For me, it just kind of happened. I was practicing to a lot of Black Dahlia Murder many years ago. I honestly spent months just practicing to Trevor to try to nail his style because I thought it was really cool. And as I got more proficient in switching between my low-pitched false chords into high-pitched fry screams, as I would make that transition from my lows to my highs, I started to notice, it was happening at the same time. I wasn't doing it purposefully at first, but once I became aware of this, then I really went out of my way to practice it. And at first it was very difficult, but now I can do it effortlessly without really having to think about it. And so we can try an exercise to help us bridge that gap between a low-pitched false chord scream and a high-pitched fry scream. Simply scream the word whoa or wow or whatever word you want to pick and start on a low, go up into a high-pitched fry scream, and then back down into a low-pitched false chord scream. And as you transition out of one technique into the other technique, try not to make that transition so abrupt so that your false chords instantly turn off and then your fry instantly turns on. We want to kind of blur the lines a little bit. We want to try to delay that transition in our mid-range so that as we're tapering out of using our false chords and our lows and then switching into using our fry screams and our highs, our mid-range, we're kind of doing both simultaneously. Even if it's not at a high level of skill and even if it's at first just by accident, well, that's a start. And when you start to notice that you're doing a fry scream with your false chords vibrating a little bit above, well, focus on that feeling, memorize that feeling, and try to recreate that feeling.
Whoa! 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 Whoa!
Another thing that might help is warming up one technique and practicing that for like 20 minutes, whether that's fry or false chord. And then just warm up the opposite technique and try to start practicing that. You might notice that the signals get mixed and the wires get crossed in your brain a little bit. So let's say you were practicing fry screams for a little bit, and now you're trying to practice your false chord screams. And you try to throw out a false chord scream, but your brain is still in fry scream mode, and out comes a fry scream. And you're like, hold on, I'm trying to false chord scream, why does my body keep wanting me to fry scream? I remember experiencing this very early on in the first few years that I was learning metal vocals when I first started trying to practice both techniques on the same day. Because initially I practiced just false chord screaming for like 2 years, and then I stopped practicing false chord screaming for a while because I really wanted to focus on learning how to fry scream. And then eventually, when I got back into false chord screaming, I only practiced both techniques on like different days because I didn't want to confuse myself. But eventually, when I started trying to use both techniques in the same practice session, I started getting confused because I would practice one for a little bit and then I would start trying to practice the other, but I was just getting the signals mixed in my brain. And I remember having to spend like 5 or 10 minutes just trying to turn off the first technique that I was practicing and turn on the second technique that I wanted to practice in my brain. But as I was doing that process, there were also moments where I was doing both at the same time. So we can even use that confusion to help us do both techniques simultaneously, even if it's just by accident at first. I think most people will find this pretty easy to do in their mid-range once they start to get the hang of it. But then comes trying to learn how to do this with our other pitch ranges as well. Well, we can kind of use the same process. Maybe we start on a high-pitched fry scream and then try to transition into doing a high-pitched false chord scream and vice versa. And we still try to blur those lines a little bit. Try not to make that transition so abrupt to where we just stop one technique and instantly start the other. We want to blur those lines and we want to make that transition gradual, so we're tapering out of doing one and then tapering into doing the other so that there's just individual moments where we might notice both happening at the same time. And once again, when we notice those moments, focus on them and try to recreate them.
Wow! 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 Wow!
Hopefully you were able to hear the difference between the fry scream tone and the false chord scream tone in those examples and when I was actually doing both simultaneously. That's also why I included the tunnel throat example, because I think it's a little bit easier to hear the difference. There are a lot of advantages to being able to use both techniques either simultaneously or just being able to fluidly switch between the two. For instance, whenever I do high-pitched fry screams, I tend to trail off like the last second of a high-pitched fry scream by switching into my false chords. I find that this helps reduce fatigue on my vocal cords when I'm fry screaming because it just kind of reduces the overall workload on my vocal cords. Those last few seconds where I'm using my false chords and switching out of a fry scream really add up over the course of a long practice session. Another advantage is that not only will we get the best of both worlds in the way we sound, but we can also pick the elements of each technique that come most naturally to us, that we can really perform most easily and most comfortably, and just stick with using those elements. Anyway, I hope this video helped give you some strategies for learning how to do both techniques simultaneously, and also improved your understanding of what other vocalists do when they scream. That's it for this video. If you like the way I teach metal vocals and you want to support the channel, well, please give a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe to Scream Theory. I'll see you all in the next one.